think we will start on time, as I usually like to try to do. It's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome Javier Arce Nazario from Puerto Rico. It's, as you know, a target search that we have this opportunity to bring him in to visit. He is an associate professor at the University of Puerto Rico, Wait, that's not correct. Calle. I knew I didn't do it. And his talk is called Landscape Memory Conversations Between Science, Art, Human Perception, and Environmental Change. So thanks very much. Welcome.
Thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you very much for all of you being here. Let's see this. Yeah, so that's the title, Landscape Memory, Conversations Between Science, Art, and Human Perception or Environmental Change. Thank you very much for being here and for the invitation. Probably when you see a title like this that has the words landscape, memory, and art, probably you think about this book about Simon Schama, Landscape and Memory. But I'm not doing here environmental history or not history at all. Well, history, but I'm not a historian. And I do work with art, and I look at art and as a way to look at how cultures think about or create narratives of their environment and their environmental changes. And I can relate with some of the lines. For instance, this is a very broad line that could mean a lot of things, right? But in one of his lines in the introduction, it says, landscape and memory tries to be a way of looking at rediscovering what we already have, but which somehow eludes our recognition of, and our appreciation. So one of the things that I do when I work with landscape is to try to think about different ways to reconstruct this landscape, different narratives that can come of this landscape. And again, I work with landscapes in a completely different, in a different way. And when I look at landscape, I'm not searching for somehow an Arcadia like Simon Schama does in his work. I try to work with all different types of landscape. And landscapes, working with landscape more like landscape ecologists work with landscapes, or like geographers work with landscape, which is more of this material space in which socioeconomic processes and biophysical elements are in interaction, and these interactions shape patterns and processes, and we can see these patterns through time, and we read these patterns, right? And we read these patterns and we can narrate or think about the processes that are happening, and we can see that these patterns and these processes are interacting and changing. But also, these landscapes, to understand them, we think about scales to understand them, right? We look at it at different scales. We look at it at broad scales, at fine scales, and we understand that different processes happen at different scales. Nevertheless, it's also important to think about that, the fact that we sometimes are bounded by some limitations to look at certain particular spaces doesn't necessarily mean that we understand that this landscape that we're analyzing is completely in a vacuum. So we understand that these landscapes are shaped by processes that are not happening right here, right? That there's global processes that might be affecting and shaping this space, as well as this space affecting things that are beyond this place. What land use scientists may call telecoupling or teleconnections. So in that way, landscape then this way is a completely different, it's a different way of thinking about landscapes, and it's a landscape where it's changing. It's not a static landscapes. The same way, memory, the way I think about memory is also, I think, in different ways. In memory, when I think about memory, I think about it also in the ecological way. Ecologists use memory, of the concept of memory, in a certain way, like legacies of the past, how these processes of the past shape the present composition of the forest, and how this composition then might affect the future composition of the forest. It's just one of the examples of how they use memory and legacies. But also memory, when I work with memory, I also go into the more psychological and anthropological way of memory through oral histories and ethnographies, which again gives them the memory a more subjective perspective of what memory is, and look into how people think about space. So in a certain way, looking for more democratic ways of reconstructing the histories of these places, and not focusing only on historical reconstructions by academics only, but also by the people that live in these places. So in a sense, I work with landscape and memory in a way to reconstruct different narratives of the space, and I find them very productive in terms of trying to put into conversation what regularly is a narrative that might be constructed by an elite, trying to put it in conversation with a narrative that might be more democratic. That's one of my major interests, to try to create these more democratic narratives, and I hope I can show it to you today. Landscape and memory, these concepts have been particularly fun for me to use, in the sense that productive ways of me to think about interdisciplinary interest and to create fun projects that I think might be not only fun but interesting for doing scientific questions. So today I'm particularly going to show you how I used this inspiration of thinking about landscapes and memory in terms of a project that I did with some undergraduate students in the University of Puerto Rico on creating an exhibit using our imagery of landscape changes in Puerto Rico. And this will be the outline of today's presentation. I will start by discussing why creating this science art exhibit. What was my motivation to do this science art exhibit? My initial motivation was because we had all this information about landscape history of Puerto Rico, and then I noticed that this information wasn't getting to other people beyond academic population. So some of the things I will do is explain to you a little bit about I will explain a bit about the landscape history of Puerto Rico, so I will spend some time discussing that. Then I will talk relatively briefly about the role of art in geography and science. So I will show you some examples of how art is being used in geography and the humanities, and particularly in interaction of art and science. And then I'll discuss the methods of the exhibit, of the work that we did. I will show you visually the exhibit that we created, and then I'll show you the results, and hopefully you have some discussion and have some questions about it. So let's start with the first thing, that is the motivation of this project. And I said I will discuss to you about the land cover change of Puerto Rico. And here, just so you know, Puerto Rico is this island over here, just in case you didn't know, the Caribbean. I know you're geographers, but I'm always told that I should put that just in case you don't know where Puerto Rico is. And it's okay, I can understand. It's a small island. But yeah, so there's Puerto Rico, and this is the story that I'm going to tell us. Puerto Rico, which has a very interesting story of landscape change, which is interesting, but it's not unique. So I'm going to start telling you the story of land cover change in Puerto Rico by showing you these images that we have reconstructed for Puerto Rico, and I'm going to start the story by starting with the 1930s images, because these are the earliest images that we have for Puerto Rico. And in fact, for the United States, many of the places that you have also is the 1930s, because that was the time when there was a lot of funding for taking photographs, image of Puerto Rico, of the United States for agricultural development plans. So I'm going to show you here on the left some of the valleys of Puerto Rico, and then I'm going to show you on the right the mountainous areas of Puerto Rico. This image, we have kind of made a model using the dense cloud of the stereo imagery to make it 3D. If you're interested in more of the techie parts of how to make this thing, we can talk about it later on. But here in the left, as I said, I have the valleys, and here I have the mountainous region, and you can see clearly that both in the mountains and in the valleys, there's not much trees to be seen. Puerto Rico was highly deforested. People calculate only like 10% of the area was forested in many cases. And you can see it, there's not much trees happening here. You can see some houses along this area. And you can interestingly see how we have some houses here. It's not so clear right now in this projection, but you can see that there's some small mountains. These are karst small mountains, and how they're deforested in this area. These are close to the town, so they probably were areas that were being deforested either for construction or for fuel. So I'm trying to show you here how I read the images. Here you can see a mountain. Look at this. This is the line of the division between some farm and the other. So we can see a hedgerow here. This is forest that you will see how it shapes the sequence of the succession. But see also how the town, the houses are along the creeks. And you can see that they have recently created a road. So look at those images, or those things that I've been showing you right now, these aspects of the landscape, so you can see how it's going to be changing. So now in the 1950s, there's an agricultural decline in Puerto Rico as a result of changes in the policies of how Puerto Rico is going to develop. There's a change from agricultural society to industrial and service industry. So a lot of the people living in the mountainous regions start moving to the coastal areas of Puerto Rico and also to the cities, and eventually a lot of Puerto Ricans leave to the United States. But you can start quickly seeing how the areas that I showed you that they were deforested in this area are becoming reforested. And you can see that the valleys are still being used as agriculture. In fact, this area is, you can see that it's more mechanized in terms of mechanized agriculture. You can start seeing a few houses here and there that are increasing. But in the mountain areas, you can start seeing that there's trees starting to cover the mountains and the houses that you can see moving from what would be closer to the creeks that were having access to the water services, and now they're moving into the roads. And you can start seeing, you will see that the houses go along the roads. So here you're seeing a very simple land use, land cover changes in Puerto Rico, and similar patterns that you can see along in all over the United States and also in other places in the world. By 1977, there's a great agricultural decline and immigration in Puerto Rico, as I mentioned, and now it's obviously that we start to see that how the valleys, the agricultural valleys of Puerto Rico become completely urbanized, not completely urbanized, become more urbanized, and you can see this kind of pattern seen throughout all Puerto Rico. And again, in the mountainous area, we see even more decline in the agriculture. So in this area that was completely covered with tobacco plantations in the 1930s, now there's no tobacco plantations in the area. You can see the houses going along the roads. 1994, more suburban sprawl. You can see the reforestation in the mountainous area, as well as the houses going along the road. And 2010, more suburban sprawl, especially development in the valleys. And again, in the mountains, we don't see much of the urban development, but we can see that the mountains have been covered in forest. So the story is actually very simple, very simple in a certain way. A lot of farms in the 1930s, a lot of regrowth now in the 2010s. So now we have more forest than in the 1930s. Now we have a lot of urban cover in the urban areas in what used to be the agricultural valleys. For those of you that might be interested in more orographic type of patterns, I want to show you how you can clearly see in these images. Let's see if with this projection we can see it. How the northern part of Puerto Rico, or even within this mountain, gets reforested faster than the southern part of the mountains. Most of the rain in Puerto Rico falls into the northern part of Puerto Rico, so the southern is usually dry, and you can actually see it in this mountain already. And you can see that the pattern of reforestation is actually faster in the northern side of the mountain than in the other side of the mountain. Well, this pattern of change, again, that there's a lot of agriculture in 1930s, and now we have more forest in the present Puerto Rico. It's a pattern that has been frequently described in literature. And the people that first talked about this were foresters that started seeing this pattern of change. But it was not really until Rudell, that is a geographer in Rutgers, started discussing this, that the pattern of change was evaluated in a more complex way by looking at how different socioeconomic variables as well as spatial variables may be shaping this transition. Rudell, that presented this article in 2000, then used not only analyze this process by looking into different hypotheses and looking at different social variables and looking at different spatial variables, but he also put the process that was happening in Puerto Rico into a more global context to compare this kind of pattern to other places. Like in the United States, there were several places that we can be seeing this kind of pattern. In 2005, he uses this same process, and then he used additional data that he gets to, and then create models of what are the possible process of change of forest in different countries. For instance, he has this graph where he has forest cover in one of the axis versus time to, and he creates this type of model. But more interestingly, I think, is from the 2000 paper. He, at the end of his presentation of Puerto Rico, where he discusses all this forest that has been reforested the landscape, he goes into a debate on a provocative question of how this reforestation might actually be of beneficial to Puerto Rico, because it's at an expense of changing the economy into an industrial one, and the industrial one happened very quickly, which also resulted in a lot of industries coming in from the United States and polluting the area. So he goes into the debate of whether this amount of forest, which may seem like something very positive and something healthy for the environment, might actually be at a cost of something of other expensive in the environment. So this debate, which he brought at the end of the article, and this question that was brought, has not necessarily been taken by ecologists, but ecologists have taken this topic and have been very interested in this topic of analyzing how the forest, the reforestation of Puerto Rico has been valuable for different processes. And it has been analyzed for different variables like forest diversity and composition, and most of the studies that have looked at reforestation in Puerto Rico have really mostly focused on this, and how the process have resulted in a diverse forest, and how different agricultural activities have resulted in a different forest composition, and also have discussed how this pattern of reforestation has been so important for conservation in Puerto Rico, bird diversity, local climate, even river geomorphology. So all over there has been these debates and discussions, and analysis on how this process of change has shaped different environmental variables. And this is because Puerto Rico has this beautiful database. I mean, we have all this land cover change, and we already have them mapped in many cases, and also in my case, we have water quality data from the USGS. We have a lot of data from the USGS, so we're able to also analyze how water quality has changed in the area. So this is a picture of what other things I do. And one of the things that we have been doing is to analyze how this land cover change has shaped water quality. And the story is usually the areas that became forested, we can clearly see that there's a reduction in nutrients, sediments, and fecal contamination. I have also found this process of change in Puerto Rico very valuable to analyze how communities manage water, the value of it for water management for rural communities. In Puerto Rico, we have a lot of small community water systems, which also happens in the United States. And many of these small community water systems with very limited resources and very simple techniques, they manage their water systems, and yet we're not having some serious health problem, because most of the water that they're gathering is usually from highly forested small watersheds. So this is one of the things that I work, and also with large water systems, to look at how this reforestation has actually resulted in benefits in terms of reducing the cost of water treatment and water quality. So again, it's a highly described pattern. It has been described by a lot of different scientists, different approaches, but the person that has been the most verbal is this guy, which is Ariel Lugo. And Ariel Lugo, which is the director of the International Taxonomy, I forgot how you say it in Spanish, the Institute of International Taxonomy. He's the director, and it's an institute of the U.S. Forest Service, and he has been extremely vocal about this process, and especially he has even termed it the noble forest era. But he also has talked about it in media, in newspapers, in radio, and TV, and he has made this thing that he likes to talk a lot about. So interestingly, it's supposed to be something that everyone should be hearing about, everyone beyond the academia. However, based on my experience giving presentations using as I mentioned, talking about the water quality changes in Puerto Rico, I started noticing that this information actually was not getting to the general public. I would actually, and also based on my teaching of environmental change courses, I would actually invite experts, researchers from the United States and from Puerto Rico to give lectures in my courses. And I would actually, and I would give them within the exam that would come after people would give the lecture, I would have a question sort of like, can you describe the changes in Puerto Rico from the 1930s to the present? And most students, even though, again, they have heard the lecture from the professors, from several, they would write a story of deforestation. In the 1900s, we would have a lot of forests, and then, you know, something and whatsoever. They would create a story of deforestation. So I started thinking, well, maybe this is something only of students, right? But then when I started giving lectures, presenting the remote sensing imagery and other things related to water quality, I started asking the public to raise their hands. When did you think that there was more forest, in the 1930s or in the present? And most people would think in the 1930s there would be more forest. So I started thinking, well, what's happening here? This is not like a common information out there. So I thought, well, let's do some experiments and actually get the data, so I can actually talk about it in a paper, and not just talk about it like I just did right now. So I decided to start doing science art exhibits, and also as a way to start talking about this and talking about this in other spaces and bringing this information into other spaces. And one of the ways that we did it was doing exhibit at fairs, exhibit at a museum, which is the thing that I'm going to talk today, and also by doing presentations at community meetings. And I'm going to show a little bit of an example of what do I do when I talk about this kind of work at schools or at a community center and that kind of thing. But today I'm going to present the museum exhibit, which I think was a very successful experience. So, arts in geography it has a very long history of how it's being used. Also, not only being used in geography, but it's also a theme for discussion on how space is taught in art. But art, particularly during the last few years, has become a very important theme in geography as a way of taking geography discussions into other spaces. And also particularly it has been important during the last few years because we see a lot of publications coming in this, and not only in publications that are focused on the arts, on the humanities aspects, but also in publications in the geophysical journals. But especially this in the few years we have seen, for instance, the creation of the Geohumanities journal, which is something that happened, I believe, a year or two ago. So there's an increased interest in this kind of conversations. But again, there's a long history of this. But also something that has become extremely popular in the recent years is also the question of the digital humanities and how do we manage all this digital data that we have and the value of it to the humanities. Especially if you look into the web pages of different humanities departments throughout the United States, you will see that now they have centers for digital humanities. And digital humanities, in many of the instances, they depend on cartography for representing and showing their information. So digital humanities is becoming a major theme, and also it's a theme that is being granted. There's grant for digital humanities in different foundations and fund sources. Science and the arts, there's also a lot of examples, and it's also something that is not new. Here I'm showing you an example of arts at CERN, and I selected this example because it's probably one of the examples of something that is that if you ask a researcher from CERN, they would probably think that they're the least geographic related scientists, right? The CERN is the particle accelerator where they found the Higgs boson. So we're talking about experimental particle physicists, so they think that their experiments can happen here as in other planets, as in other universe. So understand that the concept of space is very different here. So I just wanted to show you that scientists in this realm are also interested in the arts, but in a sense also to see how their science inspire art and also to bring their scientific knowledge and discuss it in other spaces as well. So they have a similar use at the end of the day. And we could see that there's science, and this interaction of science and art is occurring at different spaces and in different ways. This is an example, for instance, of how science art how art is being taken to what traditionally is a scientific space. This is art being presented at a NSF LTER area. So this is art being taken to what is a traditionally scientific space. And here is science being taken to what it would be a traditional scientific space, like the New York Hall of Science. In this case, again, it's an artistic representation of nature. And again, it's the idea of thinking about nature in an artistic way. What is the inspiration of this nature into science, into art? And again, here's an artistic representation of talking about neurons and brain cells. So, and again, it's a creative way of talking about the brain. This is one of my favorite science art exhibits. I actually got to see this one. And it's of James Project. And again, it's the idea of making us think of different ways of nature, or different ways of classifying nature. And this example, which I saw, I have seen both examples, but this particularly one of my favorite. It's I don't know if you can see this, but he creates new species, and he thinks about the question of natural selection and the question of artificial selection, and then he creates new species, and this species is a bird that has a drill bit, but you cannot see it very well in this projection. But he creates this species that seem like they're natural objects, but then he actually alters a little bit of the details and plays with the semantics of it. Science art doesn't necessarily need to be inside a museum, either a museum of art or a space of the science, but it can be in the outdoors. And this is a science art exhibit, which is part of the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia, I believe it is. And this is the art called Particle Falls, and it's from Mario Wallach, I think. And this is a very interesting artistic project. Is that they use a sensor of particles, and they put it close to a road, and then they project the particles into a wall. So if you're walking along the streets, you can look at how this particle in the air is changing, and it creates different colors and whatsoever into the wall. So it's a very fun way of looking at the things that we don't see, right? And think about the air contamination in urban spaces. So it creates an artistic view of things that we don't see, of science, and in a very creative way. So you might think, well, there's so many creative things going out there. What is it new for me to do? Well, I hope I can show you something. That's my idea. And I think that we did something actually great. And it's new because we did a lot of work. And I think we did it in a lot of creative ways. So we started geo-rectifying a lot of images, and we geo-rectify a lot of images for this work, more than 800 images, so it covered a very big area of Puerto Rico. We rectified the images from 1930s, 1950s, and 1970s. Then the images that we used from 1994 and 2010 were already rectified, so we didn't need to rectify them. The product is also from the collaboration of undergraduate studies from the humanities, social science, and natural science. I will discuss this again too. And then we designed a virtual exhibit before the real exhibit, which I thought it was a very productive thing to be done, because it allowed us to think better what things would work and which things didn't work. And then we also administer interviews to visitors before and after the visit to the exhibit. So as I said, we geo-rectify, and this is an example of what geo-rectification. I know a lot of you know what is geo-rectification, and this slide, it's in Spanish on purpose, because so you can see, this is one of the ones that I use for the community presentations, so you can see to what level of detail then I go to discuss the rectification. And this exercise actually has been fairly good, especially with the school children, because I can tell them, like, look at these images. I mean, usually again the projector is lower, so they can actually look. So I show them, look, I have this image from 1962, and then I have this image from 2010, which has measurement. It has the latitude and the longitude, and in fact, in Spanish, this should have an accent. So it shouldn't fix them. And then I tell them, well, look into the image and see what things you see in common, right? So they can be similar. This point and this point are similar, right? And then we can put things together, and we can theorize, right? And we can see, and then we can talk about change, and we can talk about these different things. So I just wanted to show you this so you can see the process and the basic process that I try to how basic I sometimes try to make things to make different people understand the complexities or the things that we're doing in the lab. So as I said, we process different images, and we organize a lot of different images. These images from the 1930s, we obtained them from the Department of Transportation, and this was great because this was the first time that this Department of Transportation was willing to give all these images for free, and we created a collaboration where we rectify them and give them back to them. We obtained the 1960 and 1977 from the U.S. Earth Explorer, the same thing as the 1994. We obtained them from the U.S. Earth Explorer, and the 2010 we obtained them from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we actually got them in a way that we could actually do stereophotogrammetry with the image. So it's a different type of setting that is not the common one that you can get through the USGS sources, which was great because then you will see that how we use them. So as I said, we had a different student collaboration, and here I have a square of the students that actually worked in the exhibit, developing the exhibit. All these people helped in the exhibit, but these were the artists and the ones who worked hardest in the project. And here I have, as I said, it was a interdisciplinary group, and this group is the one that we met every week to think about how the project is going, what are the things that we're doing, how to change it. She's a student from natural science. She wants to be a veterinarian. So as you can see, there's nothing related to this, but she had the ideas, and she would focus on on the more natural things, I would say. And again, they were important in selecting the images that we're going to select to the project. I mean, this is a lot of images that we have. Here is the student that was the humanist. He had a lot of experience because he had worked with the museum at the University of Puerto Rico, and this is a social scientist, and now he's graduated, but now he's an environmental lawyer. Starting to be an environmental lawyer. So different perspectives and different ways of thinking about space, and but yet very productive results, I think. And one of the things that we did was to meet weekly and to make a discussion about the ideas that we had. Certain ideas didn't work, certain ideas we thought it worked, and but one of the important things that we did was this way where the exhibit we did the exhibit in this community center. This is a historic community center, which was a historical building made by the Spanish to maintain the roads from one side to the other. We developed a 3D model of the place. I mean, we didn't do it as pretty as you see it right now. We just made it just the space to see how it would fit everything there. So that was great because then that would give us an idea of how, if we were overcrowding the space with too much material. Because again, we had so many imagery and we had so many things that we could think about that, and it would actually could overcrowd. One of the things that we didn't work out was that we were trying to look at time through using flipbooks. That didn't work out. That got out of that's an example of one thing that didn't work out. Okay, so one of the other things that we did was design the interview. So we designed this interview where we would interview a sample of the visitors before coming to the exhibit and after going to the exhibit, and we would sample the visitors and would ask them the demographic data such as their age, gender, county of residence, and educational background, and then we would ask them multiple choices questions. And this is just an example of one of the multiple choice questions that we would ask, and one of the ones that I'm going to show you the data. We would ask them, when did Puerto Rico have more forest cover? From 1930 to 50, 1960 to 1980, 1990 to 2010. And we would ask them to before and after. But we not only did multiple choice questions, we also had open-ended questions like, why did you select that era? For instance, after they answered that question, we would ask them, why did you select that era? Or what part of the exhibit did you enjoy the most? That was definitely after they visit the exhibit. That was not before coming to the exhibit. And then any further comments, that would be also after they visit the exhibit. So quickly, let me show you a visual show of the exhibit, so you can have an idea of what we did. Let me make this a little bit bigger. You can see it. So, okay, this is the. So in this hall, we focus mostly on presenting change in the way of triptychs and also of interactive maps. These maps, you could actually raise them and see what was behind, how was it in the past, or how was it in the present. But mainly, the most important thing about this hall was the idea of presenting time through a triptych. And when I talk about triptych, I'm not talking about the triptych that they give you at AAA for going from point A to point B. I'm talking about the way of art, right? Of presenting things in this tree. And we created this triptychs by having and making people understand the time by also doing different color schemes. For instance, for the 1930 images, we put them in sepia. For the 50s to 60s era, we put them in black and white, and for the 2010 images, we left them in color. This wall was particularly dedicated to changes in the coastal areas. The one over here, this wall is best for showing the changes in rivers. Let me zoom in so you can see. And this was a beautiful, I think it's a beautiful triptych because you can see clearly the curvilinear. The curvilinear shape of the river, and then you can see the straight lines of the damming of the river, but yet you can see still the remnants, even though the urban area has covered the area. So people could read these things, and what we did is that we would have spaces where you could see this information. That it was mostly like telling them, like, did you notice this? Did you see this? So there's the information. But it was mostly the idea of them to be looking at the images. This hall in this area was more a creative space for thinking about how we can merge multiple images within one canvas. If you think about images of change and animation, that's actually fairly simple. You just grab a bunch of images and you make a GIF, right? And you can see it, or you can determine how fast you're going to move the GIF, or if you're going to do it like a blending. But how can we do it when we're have the restraint of having one canvas, right, in hard copy? So that was one of the things that we wanted to think. So in this way it was kind of a blending, but in this, so we also use metaphors of time, and this one was one of the ones that people liked, which is using the metaphor of the spiral. And yet you can still see the changes and the story that I've been telling you. I mean, you can see how the valleys became highly urbanized. And you can see how the mountains became reforested now. So you can see that even in this way. So and we also did some metaphors of time using clocks. This was a little bit more complicated to see, and I'm not going to spend time showing to you. But it's 5 images together, so in the same place, so it requires a little more time to appreciate. But also we had a hole that a space where we would show images in anaglyphs, stereo anaglyphs, and the idea that we had it here, and so this area was focused on Calle, where the area was where the exhibit was presented, and we showed black and white anaglyphs and color anaglyphs, and if I had brought the anaglyph classes, you could have seen them in 3D. And one of the ideas to have the anaglyph presentation here was because visitors would have our classes, and as you will see, there was actually close to you could see the sidewalk and the entrance here and the space here. So the idea was so people that would be walking would see weird people with anaglyph glasses, and they would be interested in I don't know if that necessarily worked, but okay, so let's see some of the results, especially with the multiple choice answers. And this is one of the most interesting. And as I said, I kind of expected this because, again, from my previous examples. I presented it here as a percentage of respondents, and you can see that before visiting the exhibit, most people thought that most of the forest was in the past, and in the fact, then after seeing the presentation, they see that most of the agriculture, most of the forest was not necessarily in the past. So this was important from a pedagogical point of view, telling that, you know, that the fact that, that they thought that before going to the exhibit that most of the area was covered, they thought that most of the forest was in the past, and now they think that, you know, that not necessarily that's the case. And that's interesting because most of the people actually, before visiting the exhibit, actually said that there was most agriculture in the past. So there's this kind of weird understanding of forest, right? And where those forests are, and how space is used, right? And this is actually particularly interesting and useful that we did the open-ended questions and the open-ended and the answers to these open-ended questions, right? And this is one of the very common themes that were given by the interviews. We did posteriori a classification of the open-ended answers, right? And this is like 75% of the people that got it wrong said something like this. Well, it is common sense. In the past, there were fewer people, and now there are more people and more construction. So there's definitely this kind of Malthusian type of construct of how things work. And that actually was very common, and very similar narratives. I mean, I just got this one because I actually was the one who did the transcripts, and this one was the guy. It was a guy, and he was like, this is common sense, you know. But interestingly, also we had things like this. People that actually were actually born in the 1941, right? And this person said, I know this because I lived it. I was born in 1941 in Calle, and when you traveled from Calle to Caguas or to Salinas, you would see forest on both sides. I lived this, I did not imagine it. So again, it's an interesting result, and this kind of relates a lot with some of the work that I've been, I'm sort of extracting this information, right? So some of the things that I've done before with iguanas and with invasive species, some of the things that happen with invasive species that people in Puerto Rico think that they're everywhere. But when we have done a sampling of the species and look at their distribution in the land, you can see that they're mostly in the roads, close to the roads. So then people have a construct that they're everywhere. And this might be actually some similar kind of situation happening. Also, when we asked for general comments, and we had some beautiful results like this, and I hope that every time I teach a course, I will get something, a comment like this. Well, I'm going to read it. This experience was interesting because that my answers before were wrong, and things have not happened the way my logic suggested. So that's a very gratifying result. We also asked people what were their favorite aspects of the exhibit, but in general, overall, people like, we cannot say that something was the thing that they liked the most. In general, they kind of like more the anaglyphs, and people suggested that they liked the anaglyphs because it was about Calle, you know, and a lot of people that visited the place were actually from the place, so they were like, oh yeah, I like the anaglyphs because, you know, they're from Calle, but they talked about, you know, liking all the other holes, and you could also see that people that said, you know, I like cartography, I like mapping, I thought this was cool, you know, so people that were more interested in certain aspects then were more motivated for that. But that's a very good result for creating an exhibit, because then that means that we did an exhibit that gave interest for different levels of interest of the public. One of the things that I requested my students, and that I did myself, was to look at take notes of what people were conversing in the different homes. And one of the interesting conversations that came fairly often was the discussion of how we can see this landscape changing, and how little interest is in the government in asking the communities, the leadership on the communities to participate on on changing, on the plans for land use planning and changing the land. And that has been actually a valuable collaboration that has resulted from this kind of work, in where community members of a group in Calle have become very interested in this data set, because they have been starting to use this image, in a sense, as a counter mapping type of image. I will explain you how they have been using it, compared to the development plans of the mayor. And you can see that this very beautiful plans for the city of Calle, very beautiful. But here, you can see this again. It's the same story. We have the valleys, the agricultural valleys, becoming urbanized areas. And this little place here is the last remaining agricultural valley of Calle. And there they want to do an outlet. So the community members have actually used these images of change to use it as a very powerful narrative of, look, this is the last remaining piece of agricultural valley. So in a certain way, this has been served as a counter-mapping effort in contrast with other types of narratives and images. So generally, the observations and the conclusions here is that this creative approach can carry geographic understanding beyond the academic realm, is what I want you to understand. And there's this, this creates a space for conversation among different groups. We can move this information beyond the academic realm. But it was a very exciting experience to put the students into this way of thinking, of looking at ways of moving the information that we do in the bench beyond the university gates. So since I need to talk here about future ideas, I definitely need to discuss how this fits into future projects for myself. I think it's important to keep doing this kind of work in terms of undergraduate education, because it was a very effective way of translating the information that is happening in the scientific spaces to other spaces. But also, I think was a very effective experience, because many of the students that got participated in georectifying, they kind of started saying that they were feeling better at taking math, and they were feeling that they were doing, especially one of the dental students that was doing georectification told me, in the section of spatial reasoning on my exam, I did great. And I don't know if you know about dental exams, but dental exams, pre-dental exams for students to go into dental school, they have a spatial reasoning section. So he felt like this experience was so important for him that, you know, that then I started thinking about, well, could this be very important for spatial reasoning? And the fact is that there's some study that suggests so. So I'm thinking about, along the lines, to be thinking of how integrating students into this kind of activity can sort of how, some way or another, try to bring this theme of spatial reasoning and evaluate how it affects their spatial reasoning. And I know there's funds on this, both from the NSF and the NIH and from the Department of Education. But also, I think that from the endowments of the arts, we could try to fund this kind of artistic aspects of it. Again, from these, particularly I want to keep expanding on this aspect of outreach and to incorporate also the research and the results that we get from the water quality research. As I presented mostly here was mostly a part of the remote sensing aspect of the work. One of the things that I want to do is incorporate the water aspect, but again, I would like to get involved in different groups that I know that exist, that are doing interdisciplinary research and are interested in land use, land cover change, yet are not taking this information beyond the academic spaces. So I think that this is a good model to start doing that, and if I can be as a tool or as a part of the group to promote this, I think that this will be a very fun activity. As much as I can think of interesting questions that I can do to the visitors, I need to think even more about what can this be, if I can take these kind of questions that I did in Puerto Rico to other places. Furthermore, one of my future projects that I want to do is actually to start doing this project, not I'm talking about the exhibit, I'm talking about looking at landscape change in general, landscape memories in other Caribbean islands. And particularly, thinking about it from a critical point of view in terms of how this model of change, of this noble forest and this idea only of forest change might be creating certain way of thinking that might not be necessarily promoting democracy or proper or democracy in this island. So I'm thinking of ways to think of landscape memories in other Caribbean islands, and that would be a sort of a project that I would like to develop in the future as a long-term career in terms of making myself a Caribbeanist of the landscape in a certain way, that I could have the data, create the database, generate the database and organize the database for other researchers to analyze these changes and be able to visualize it. And again, this can, I think, be funded by different foundations and research agencies. So before I finish, I would like to acknowledge my students that were part of this. Again, the Fabiola, Carlos, and Armando, which were the most active in this project. But again, we had a lot of different students that participated in the rectification of the imagery, and also people that scanned the imagery and gave us this imagery for free. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it and that you got inspired to look at other ways to provide your information in other spaces. Thank you very much. Any question?
A question. So what's the problem with flip books? Why didn't you flip books?
Yeah, the problem with flip books was that at the scale of the flip book, you cannot really see much what's happening.
So the
So the little, it's too small. And then when you put a big one, it doesn't really work. So the flip books work with the thumb kind of thing.
Yeah.
Unless I would have done the big one that you crank.
Yeah.
And then that would have been like a much difficult thing to do. Yeah.
Right.
Brian.
Well, thanks. I thought that was really interesting talk and inspiring ideas. I'm just curious. I know you went to the AAGs. I wonder if you participated at all in the Anthropocene sessions, or what you might see interfacing with your ideas here about sort of people's perception of our impact on landscape over time and the Anthropocene, this whole concept.
Well, thank you for that question. And I haven't thought about, it's interesting because I haven't thought about it with the Anthropocene type of concept, right? I think I would have to think about which aspect of the Anthropocene are this. Again, it would be interesting, for me it's interesting to think about these aspects of the environment that people cannot see. And with the Anthropocene and the effect of humans in the environment, I think that, for instance, let's see how I could think about ways to integrate it. With the Anthropocene, I think we could do artistic exhibits and efforts by looking. Let's see. I need to think about it. I haven't thought about it well. Is that Anthropocene is such a broad theme, right?
And a problematic one.
Sorry.
And a problematic one, but maybe an interesting.
Yeah, no, exactly. I'm just trying to think about it because right now I'm thinking about the water, and I'm still thinking about it, and I'm thinking about working with the issue of what people think is the things that affect mostly water, right? And I already clearly see that that people are going to start thinking that the things that affect water is usually people dumping things into the water or throwing trash into the water, and not think about the less obvious processes like land cover change and land use change, right? And I think that with Anthropocene, it could do similar thing, right? What are the effects of the human that are not so obvious, and many of them is related to carbon, to our carbon budget, right? So to our use and obsession with carbon, right? But I would have to think about ways to present it because it's not so simple in terms of with the medium that I've been using, which is the land use, the landscape imagery, right? Yeah. But it would be a fun thing to think about.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was just thinking instantly of, I'll just give you my thought, was that the length of the Anthropocene, this whole idea of the early impact that we've had on atmospheric carbon, gets right at your point that we are very inefficient in our utilization of the landscape and probably deforested much faster earlier on than we ever thought. So, but I mean, it's a larger different time scale, but
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of cool.
With glacials, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
with glacials, there's already some examples of artists doing
Yeah.
work with glacials.
Yeah.
Marla, or, sorry,
Actually, this
No.
sort of follows up on Brian's, if I may.
So is mine.
Okay.
I think I got excited what you just said about what's not visible and what people privilege in terms of like thinking about dumping. Because I think Androcene, for example, as Earl Ellis defines it, is incredibly privileging the in situ and not the larger changes. So you kind of said that at the beginning, is that landscapes are influenced by processes around the world and are influencing processes around the world. And Androcene is really useful to start thinking about the degree of our impact and how every place has been impacted. But I think it has done some damage in getting people to think about just putting layers in a map and not some connection.
Well, yeah. Do you want to respond?
Well, is that I think about it like more a suggestion or
Yeah. Well,
define another question.
yeah, and maybe I was hoping connect the dots. But
No,
I guess
no, but
here's
this-
the question that you said. So right at the beginning, you said that you talked about Riddell's papers and said it was an oft-repeated pattern. And then I was wondering if you're going to come back to process. You started out talking about pattern and process, and that they're sometimes you have to connect the dots.
To the pattern and process. Well, I mean, definitely within the exhibit, we taught people to look at how to read the landscape and how to see that the patterns actually were defined by different processes and how we can read the patterns in terms of process. I think in that sense, within the exhibit, that was actually discussed. And one of the things that actually when people were interviewed afterwards in the exit interviews, people were asked what things that they have learned, and one of the things that they have actually learned was actually process of succession, for instance, in terms of, and also the issues of how we can read the landscape in terms of, again, the curvilinear type of things and the linear features, and how the linear features are usually so anthropogenic, right? And so I think in that sense, I think that the issue of integrating pattern and process is sort of discussed in a way. Does answer your question?
Yeah, you also mentioned population moving.
Oh yeah.
People leaving or people living in different types of stuff.
Yeah, in the discussion of, for instance, when one of the imagery talks about the creation of a dam, and again, the dams in Puerto Rico are really small. But dams are usually in the world one of the reasons why people are a lot of small communities that traditionally have lived in a place are moved. So when this was presented, this aspect of the topic was discussed. So one of the things that I think about doing this exhibit is not to only talk about the patterns and process that might be only occurring in Puerto Rico, but what is the value of this and representative in other places in the world. Kendra.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about the ethics of your findings, given that one of the primary narratives in climate change science is that residents of landscapes are quite reliable narrators of the climate changes that they're experiencing, and that if you want to understand how a landscape is changing, you talk to the old people, because they're the ones who lived it. And so you are saying, in fact, they are not reliable narrators, because they are not reporting what the truth-telling satellites are telling us. So,
That's interesting how you find that.
yeah, so are you privileging,
Thank you very much for that question.
I mean, what's
Yeah.
the story here? Because this could be problematic.
Problematic. No, great question. But I think that the idea is to be critical at the end of the day, right? Someone can misread this and create that narrative, right? And I have been thinking about this, and when I discuss what the person said, and I might say, they got it wrong, which I should have not said if I said it, and now it's recorded, so you can probably verify. Is that again, but it's the idea of trying to see what people are thinking, right? And not in a way of being, what is the word? What I'm saying, either it's right or wrong. There's a beautiful word to say this.
Polemic?
Sorry?
Polemical?
No.
Binary.
Oh my God, I just forgot the word. But just I think it's effective to try to go and ask, right, and try to see what people understand of the land. And the fact is that when you do oral history there's a tradition that the old not necessarily is. I mean, there's the hunter that might be very young and might know a lot about the environment more than the old guy. So again, also we need to try to not go into the same way that we might create myth based on our perceptions of remote sensing. We also have to be proactive and not creating myths about people's understanding of the land.
Mhm.
But, yeah.
And that there might be multiple truths about what people are saying. Like what that guy is saying might not be incorrect. He might not be misremembering.
His world was more
Right,
organized. Yeah.
What's that?
His world becomes more organized and less sparse.
Right, I mean, he
For real,
may,
yeah.
his perceptions might be quite legitimate, but there might be something, he might be seeing something at a scale
Yes,
that is not
exactly.
being picked up by the.
No, exactly, and one of the things, thank you so much for these questions, and let's see, I don't like to, when one gives a presentation, one has to be a little bit less critical of himself because, but it's good that you bring it. But for instance, one of the things that I think about it, I mean, I have a concept of forest, right? What is the concept of forest? So when I do this question, am I creating this idea? I'm also making an idea of what the forest actually means. But then that's why it's important to compare to the one of the agriculture, right? To see, well, what's happening here. But again, maybe forest for people is actually green, just areas that are green spaces. So in a certain way, if we think about it that way, again, I'm putting a description of what forest ought to be, or what green space ought to be, right?
I'm just wondering, when you interviewed people, did you ask them how they reconciled their memory that didn't correspond with your answer?
No, we did not confront them.
With
No.
the,
No, we did not confront them. We did not
that
confront
might be interesting to find out their explanation for how they looked at these pictures and still came away with answers that corresponded with their memory that were different from what you thought that they should take away.
No, we did not do that. We actually asked them still what was the reason for their answer. And the only person that actually said that still that there was more forest in the past, he said, oh, well, I only looked at the anaglyphs and I left. So he probably thought already that there was something wrong on on his answer. Maybe he saw it in the interviewer, sorry. Yeah. But thank you. I'll actually, I think that this will be a fun thing to do in the future.
So did you ask people about, so they didn't recognize the changes to the landscape, or had the wrong perception of the changes to the landscape, but you asked them about the social and policy changes that reside behind it, and did they know that better than the landscape change?
No, I did not go into this. I mean, I wanted to be kind of efficient with the
Right.
interviews. Yeah. No, but that's again, so something that can be evaluated. And
Because when they got the agriculture thing right, they know there's less agriculture now, is that what he said? So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so and the people that got it right, would mention, I mean, well, in the past there were all this agriculture, so if you do agriculture, you have to deforest to make agricultural land, so, definitely there was more agriculture in the past, and now there's less. There was less forest. But also people that describe actually that they knew about the process, they also would discuss like saying, well, I seen photographs of Puerto Rico, and you can see in the photographs from the past that you can see the mountains, that there's no trees, and now you can see trees all over Puerto Rico. It's actually very dramatic. I mean, the change. I don't recall the numbers right now off the top of my head, but it's. I mean, you saw it in the images. It's highly reforested. Yeah.
I guess I'd like to ask a question kind of based off what Brian was asking about sort of the primacy you place on visuality in this work. Because it strikes me that maybe like vision is not always a good way to judge landscape change. I mean, there's been, last summer, for instance, I was out in the coal fields in eastern North Dakota, and what's remarkable about the coal fields is that they look pristine. And there's this very detailed mapping that happens of the land before they get strip mined, and then everything has to get rebuilt. So you have to make piles of sediment and then put them back in the order that you took them out. And the land has to have the same degree slopes, and the fences have to be back where the fences were, the trees have to be back. And if you get invasive plants on a slope, then they have to be cut down, and you have to reseed the whole slope. And so you can get actually visual evidence of a landscape which promotes like non-change. I mean, everything might be 30 or 60 or 90 feet lower than it was because they've taken out a huge coal seam. But the landscape itself, the sort of visual evidence would promote like a kind of a misunderstanding of what's happened. So I wondered if you thought about the promise or limitations of vision.
No, great. I actually, I haven't been so critical about that, but that's interesting because I actually have dealt with this issue in other aspects. But I don't think that this would be a tool for everyone, right? A tool for every question in environmental change. I mean, I think that particularly for this case, it worked out very well because we have these transitions that are actually fairly simple to see with our eyes. So I think in this case it actually can work. And also, again, it goes back to the same issue that I presented at the beginning, that how that this could give us a bad interpretation of how that everything is fine, right, in Puerto Rico, because we're getting a lot of forests. So so environmentally we're doing, from that perspective, we're doing well, right? So that could lead to that. But in terms of the visual aspects, I think it would be great for me actually to write down something criticizing myself. And that's and the fact is that I have thought about this before, and I have worked on the aspects of oral histories and how people see spaces that we actually cannot see with remote sensing, especially when we think about places that are of religious value, for instance, is one of the common themes, for instance. But in the case of the Amazon, I mean, and there's something written about this, is how people talk about these mythical places. And you might say, oh, well, then why do I care about mapping those places? I mean, those are crazy ideas that people have, right? But no, but actually people relate to the land in this way. So, and what do we do when we cannot map these places or present them visually? And then in those cases where then art can be actually very valuable because people use myth to create art, and in the case of the Amazon, people use the ayahuasca theme to create art, and then that art can talk about these places in a different way. So yeah, so maybe we can do it visually, maybe not necessarily with remote sensing imagery, but also from other perspectives. So that's the idea, to keep it creative and critical analysis. Thank you very much for that question.
So, do you believe that Puerto Rico's negative population growth and increasingly older population, as compared to many other Caribbean nations and other Latin American nations in this area, have had a profound effect on the number of farmers and people that are in the agricultural industry in Puerto Rico, that has therefore caused this great shift in the geographical maps?
Yeah, no, definitely. The big difference of Puerto Rico with other islands in the Caribbean, because you asked the question with the Caribbean, right, is that we're a territory of the United States. So for Puerto Ricans to move out of Puerto Rico is very easy. I mean, we just moved to the United States, that's it. And in fact, if you look at analysis of by percentage of population of Puerto Rico, we actually win throughout since the 70s as the country with more people moving out of Puerto Rico. So as you can see, it's a very different story, the story of immigration in Puerto Rico from the other Caribbean islands. Jamaica also has some situations where there was a moment there's a lot of immigration going on, but Puerto Rico is so particular. And then we get all this money and all this support that then changes the market in Puerto Rico in terms of who decides to work in agriculture, then the value of agriculture is very different. So it's not like in other countries where that might be, people can need to work in agriculture. In Puerto Rico, a lot of people don't necessarily need to work in agriculture to make a living if they don't, because they have access to other resources. So yeah, it's a very different story, but thank you for the question.
Javier, a quick question about your orthorectification. So just by chance, we live in Franklin County here. Franklin County has something like what you had, layers of historical air photos, which they corrected and made more or less work in that you could sort of peel one off and see below and peel one off. And they wanted to go back a couple more decades, and they had this huge stack of aerial photographs. They said, what would it take to take all these photographs and pin them on the page and move them? So, wow, that's thousands of hours of work. Did you do thousands of hours of work to do this, or did
Thousands? Oh my God.
You
You know, I would guess so. Actually, I've never done the calculation. I have a lot of volunteers, and I had some funds, and yeah.
Did you?
But I actually have a lot of volunteers.
Was it all manually done?
It was manually done.
Yeah. There's no good way to.
No, but there's good ways now. There's amazing ways now, and that they do the stitching. But
Yeah.
still, you need the good control points to do a good rectification. Manual rectification is still much better, but now there's all these programs that do the stitching very quickly, and then they do the point density, the dense point, based on the stereo matching of the images. So
Were you able to take advantage of the current base map in a sense to get accurate to DEM or whatever?
yeah. Well, no. Well, for the control points, then I use the current images, and the current images are rectified, right? And the idea, they might not be perfectly rectified because I did not look for points and went to with a GPS and verify that, but for the sense of my interest, which is to analyze them through time to a certain particular place, well, using the present image, it worked. So yeah, so I used the 2010 as the base map to create the control points.
Very good.
Yeah, and depending on the images that I use, if it was the 1950s and 1970s images, we ortho-rectified it by doing triangulation and bundle. I forget the name of it now. But by using the fiducial marks and the camera information to create the triangulation and to do the ortho-rectification.
Excellent. Time for any more questions before everybody leaves. It is late on a Friday, and thanks to
and thank you very much for staying so late on a Friday. I understand that probably you're ready to go for the weekend.
Let's give Javier a round of applause.